All right, this video will introduce you to a particular type of short answer question, the one we refer to as the primary source type. In the primary source type of short answer, you are provided with, as the name suggests, a primary source. Now, this could be a text, could be in text form, but often it's visual. And the type of visual varies. It could be a photograph, a political cartoon, a painting, a chart or a graph, a map, and probably anything else. In some of these, the visual is really just meant to introduce you to an idea or a topic. You should be familiar with the visual or the data that's provided or the historical topic that the cartoon is addressing. And so it's really just a stimulus to get you thinking about that era. Then the rest of the short answer would really resemble the straightforward type, which we've discussed in another video. The questions are, as that name suggests, pretty straightforward after that. They're simply asking you what may have caused whatever it is that you're seeing in this visual, or what might the effects of this have been. Really, there's nothing unique to say about this type of short answer when that's the way it's presented to you. You could write these as you would write any other type. Let me give you an example of that type of primary source short answer where it really is straightforward. Okay, I hope that's not confusing you, but this would be a good example. You're given a map. And it's not really the details of the map that they're interested in. The map is depicting transatlantic trade during the 18th century or during the 1700s, colonial era transatlantic trade between the New World, Europe, and Africa. This is something that you are generally already aware of. They could simply say, think about transatlantic trade, and then answer these questions. But the map is there to kind of, like we said, act as a stimulus, maybe to help you out a little bit, give you a little bit of a reminder as to what was being traded back and forth. But the image isn't particularly important in answering this question. Now, if you look at the parts of the question, you can see that they are pretty straightforward. Part A simply says, briefly explain a historical development that contributed to, caused the emergence during the 18th century of the patterns depicted in this map. So in other words, what were some of the causes that led to increased transatlantic trade in the 1700s? And then parts B and C are almost identical. Briefly explain a specific historical effect that resulted from this. So as a result of this trade, what happened? And then give another one in part C. All right, so again, this is a pretty straightforward short answer question. The primary source, in this case a map that is given to you, is really just to help you, maybe remind you of some things. But for the most part, you would approach this like you'd approach the straightforward short answer. Identify and explain causes and effects, or it's possible this could be written in a different way. It could be comparison or continuity and change over time. But from my experience, most of these are just causation, cause and effect type short answers with a visual stimulus. But as I mentioned, it might go a different direction. Another type of primary source short answer, and you'll know it right away, because in part A, it may ask you to describe a perspective that is expressed in the source. So again, you'll be given a source. It could be text, could be photo, cartoon, painting, etc. And it'll say what perspective is being expressed in this source. Now, to be fair, usually it's not a chart, graph, or map. Maps don't express perspectives, but photographs can. Political cartoons absolutely can. Even a painting can. And certainly a primary source text could. A speech that someone gave certainly could express a perspective. So if that's what it's about, if part A has that word perspective in it, then it's helpful to remember what we mean by perspective. Perspective can also be defined as point of view. It refers to a very particular way that someone or some group perceives something. It's a biased view, okay? And we're not worried about is that right or wrong or are they correct? But what they want to see that you understand is that this visual, this political cartoon, is expressing someone's perspective. So you want to stop and ask yourself, who may have created this source? Who drew this cartoon? Who wrote this speech? Who's in this photograph? Now, you may not know their exact name, and even if you were given it, you might say, well, I don't know who that is. But you want to stop and think, what would their perspective be? How would they view this moment in history or this particular historical development? Okay, what perspective do they have on things? And then in part A, you're asked to describe that perspective. As always, choose one perspective and stay very focused on it. Don't guess. Don't throw a couple of ideas out there. Well, they might see it this way, but they could also see it this way. No. Maybe you've got a couple ideas, but take the time to think, which of these do I feel is a better answer, and then stay laser focused on it. Now, from there, it once again becomes pretty simple. Parts B and C will likely ask you to either support that perspective or maybe refute it with historical evidence. So part B might say, briefly explain one specific piece of historical evidence, some development, something that happened in history that would support whatever this person is trying to say, whatever their perspective is. Or maybe something that counters their perspective. Or parts B and C may ask for cause and effect. What happened that may have caused them to have this perspective? Or what might be the effect of this perspective on history? Okay? I'll give you an example of that one. So here's a photograph. Now, at this point, you may or may not recognize this photograph or recognize what it's all about, but these are women who are protesting, picketing outside the White House in 1917. They're members of the National Woman's Party. This is a party that, a minor political party, but that had formed solely to fight for women's suffrage, women's right to vote. And they did something rather unprecedented. They picketed the White House, something that virtually no one did, man or woman, before this. Part A asks you to briefly describe one perspective about women's rights expressed in the image. So again, you would ask yourself, who are these women? What do they think? What's their perspective about women's rights? And you might say something like, they believe that women should actively participate in politics, and that is why they're picketing. Or you might say their perspective is that women's rights are not equal to those of men or are not complete until women are given the right to vote. Okay, but again, you would want to pick one of those and describe that perspective, making sure you relate it to the image, connect it back to what's going on in this photograph or what the political cartoonist is depicting if it were a political cartoon. And then you can see parts B and C are talking about, part B is talking about causation. Briefly explain one specific historical development before this period that led to demonstrations such as the one depicted. And right now, if you're watching this video early in the year, you might not recognize the significance of, say, 1848, but that's a big clue as to something you might use to answer this. Then part C is actually a comparison question. They want you to briefly explain a difference between this women's rights movement, the one that begins in 1848 and continues through 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. They want you to explain the difference between that era and the women's rights movement that comes much later, the modern or feminist movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s that we will study later in the year. Okay, so again, you can see that these questions are always coming back to those historical reasoning skills, cause and effect, comparison, continuity and change over time. But I wanted to share with you in this video what a primary source short answer might look like. And often we see this type where they ask you to describe a perspective. That is often the most important part of the question, most easily missed. And as you can see, if you don't really nail that perspective, you don't get that, then you might struggle with the other parts.